Good morning, my brothers and sisters. I'm glad to be back with y'all with this new teaching. Knowing the difference between Christian liberty and biblical license or religious license. We all had religion, whether it was Bible-based religion or some other religion. We all had religion that was based on a book before we come to the reality, the eternal reality of Christ in the Spirit. So let us get started in the teaching. And it is my prayer to God the Father through Christ that all that come in contact with these teachings get to taste the eternal liberty of living in the Spirit. Because once you taste it, it ain't no turning back. So let us get started. Knowing the difference between Christian liberty and biblical license. And to know the difference between liberty and license, you have to know the difference between the flesh and the spirit. And this does not happen until one is born of the Spirit, because that ability comes from Christ himself. That is the ability of Christ in our spirit, separating the two. Liberty is freedom from the flesh. License is the flesh operating outside of the fruit of the Spirit. It's the flesh outside of the government of the Spirit. The flesh is in license, but it's not under the government of eternal liberty. The purpose of being liberated from the flesh is to be able to take authority over the flesh. But before we can take authority over the flesh by the fruit of Christ's Spirit, we have to be freed from the sins and trespasses we are spiritually dead in the Spirit. So that comes through being born of the Spirit. We have to be born again. Christ is the author and finisher of our faith. It begins through being born of the Spirit, and it translates to the flesh according to the first fruit likeness of the Spirit. We have to be born of the Spirit in order to be restored back to his image, to the image of Christ in the Spirit, and through that image, he will make alive the soul and body by the first fruit likeness of Christ. Now, in the likeness of Christ is the living and the leading of the Spirit, which in all these things is the liberty of the Spirit. We're liberated. We're liberated. 2 Corinthians 5:7, for we walk by faith, not by sight. We go from biblical faith by sight in the flesh, which is superficial faith, to supernatural faith in the Spirit, which is Christ's faith. This is a divine faith that we're born into when we're born back into the Spirit of Christ, which happens alone by the power of Christ. All divine works are a work of grace towards us. It's all a work of grace towards us. So we walk by faith, not by sight. As we walk by the revelation of faith, in spiritual faith, which is sight of a different kind. Spiritual faith is divine insight. Faith is not blind. Spiritual faith is divine insight. As we begin to walk by divine insight beyond the flesh, we'll stop existing by sight, which is limited to the flesh. All right, let's go to Romans 9:8. Romans 9:8 says that they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as the seed. Well, the children of the flesh, they're outside of the Spirit. They're in religious license, or you could say they're in biblical license. Now, the Bible is not evil, but what is happening a lot of the times today is that it's being unlawfully used. It's being unlawfully used to bring people into a place of bondage where they operate in biblical license, as opposed to it being taught from a place of liberty where people begin to spiritually taste the fruit of liberty. Because we have to go from the letter. When you go from license to liberty, you're going from the letter to the light. You're going from the law, which is the Ten Commandments, which was not made for a righteous spiritual man or woman, going from the law to the person Christ himself, which is grace, who is the righteousness of the law. So the children of the flesh are not the children of God, but the children of the promise, those that have been born back into the promise, those who are spiritually in the spirit of promise, which is Christ himself. They're counted as the seed. They are the true children of God. And once you become a child of God, Romans 8:16, it's confirmed by the Spirit of God. Then you go from Romans 8:16 to Romans 8:14, where as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. Now, it does not say as many as are born of the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. No, when you become a child of God, Romans 8:16, it's confirmed by the Spirit of God. You know it. You're alive in that confirmation. When you go to Romans 8:14, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. There you go from childhood and you enter into sonship. Sonship is when you begin to be led of the Spirit. That is where you enter into the living, which is the liberty of the Spirit. You begin to live independent of the flesh and everything in the flesh. And from there we go to Ephesians 4:15, growing up into the head, spiritually maturing as gospel men and women, growing up into the head, which is all things, which is Christ. So there's 3 stages as to maturing into a full-blown Christian man or woman. Second Corinthians 3:17. Now the Lord is that Spirit. The Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. There's liberty from the world, the flesh, and the devil. There's liberty from license. You're liberated. You're freely liberated by the power of God into the purpose of God. You go from his biblical will to his eternal purpose. All liberty is in the Spirit of Christ. There's no liberty outside of that. But if we're not in the Spirit, we can confuse license with liberty because we don't know the difference. We only know the difference once we're born into the Spirit, and Christ gives us the ability to discern the difference. Outside of that, we don't know it. Because these are spiritual issues, and the flesh cannot understand the things of the Spirit. For Galatians 3:24-25. For the law was our schoolmaster under Christ. For the law was our schoolmaster under Christ, that we would be justified by faith. The letter of the law, the letter of Christ, was our schoolmaster unto the gospel of Christ, that we would be justified by the faith of Christ. You see, we were given the letter of Christ in the flesh while being dead in our sins and trespasses in the Spirit. But once born of the Spirit, we go from operating in license in the flesh to the liberty of Christ's Spirit, which is the gospel. We go from malehood back to manhood, back to spiritual manhood. We go from femalehood back to spiritual womanhood. Once we come alive in the Spirit, we once again spiritually mature as men or women in the Spirit. We have to distinguish our malehood from our manhood, our femalehood from our womanhood. "25. But once that faith is come, we are no longer under a schoolmaster." Once faith is come, you're liberated from the letter to the light. You're liberated from the flesh to the Spirit. And now you begin to walk as you receive revelation of the Spirit, because you've now entered into eternal purpose. You've now entered into eternal purpose. Eternal purpose, where you become fruitful. You become eternally fruitful as being a Christian, as opposed to being biblically active or religiously active as a male or female. We go back to being fruitful. The Lord wants us to be fruitful. And in being fruitful, we become eternally successful. Well, what does it mean to be fruitful? To be fruitful means to be Christ-like. Once you restored back to his image in your born again spirit, and you bear his likeness in the flesh, which is the fruit of the spirit, well then as you multiply in fruit, you multiply in his likeness. This is what was said in the beginning when the Lord said, be fruitful and multiply. Continue to multiply in the likeness of Christ, where it becomes so evident that you belong to Christ. It becomes apparent right away. And this is what the Lord wants in the children of the Spirit, the children of the promise, those who are counted as the seed. We have to be in the promise of God. And to be in the promise of God, we have to be spiritually, as men and women, in the Spirit of God. Galatians 5:16. Galatians 5:16. This I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. Walk in the Spirit. Walk in the Spirit. Abide in the nature of Christ in the Spirit. Abide in the liberty of the Spirit, so it can translate into the first fruit living of the Spirit. Abide in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. You're not going to revert back to license. You're going to continue in liberty. You're going to continue in the liberty of Christ, where you can be fully liberated from the flesh and live beyond the flesh and not exist subject to the flesh. Let us go to Romans 12, 1, 2, and 3 as we come to a close. Romans 12, 1, 2, and 3. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice. That you present your bodies. That's the male and female body. That you present your bodies a living sacrifice, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service, which is your only service. We are to be living sacrifices, not a dead sacrifice. When we're sacrificed, supernaturally sacrificed on the altar of the cross, we become living sacrifices because we become crucified to the flesh, to the letter of Christ in the flesh, so that Christ can live through us by revelation of the Spirit. That's the gospel of the Spirit. So we have to present ourselves living sacrifices. 2, and be not conformed to this world. Don't conform back to religious license. Be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Not change, because things can change in the flesh, but yet change in the flesh becomes a disguise for what is now hidden in the Spirit. That's why we must have the divine insight of the Spirit, so we can go beyond the disguise of change and see that individual's spiritual condition, whether it be that of Christ or just a religious front on the outside, attempting to hide their spiritual depravity on the inside. But be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove, that means to discern, what is that good, just, acceptable, well-pleasing, and perfect, that's spiritually mature or complete. What is that perfect will of God? What is the perfect will of God? Now, the will of God was the letter of Christ. That was in the flesh. But we go from the will of God to the purpose of God, which is eternal in the gospel of the Spirit. But we have to distinguish between the will and the purpose. 3, for I say through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, that's man or woman, that he ought not to think more highly than he ought, but to think soberly, according as God had dealt to every man or woman the measure of faith. When you're born of the Spirit, you have the measure of faith because you're born into Christ. And Christ is the measure of faith. He's the eternal measure of faith. Anything that comes as faith must be measured by the measure of faith because he's living faith. Anything outside of him is simply existing faith. He's living prosperity. Anything outside of him, it's something existing or material that they may be calling prosperity, but it's really not prosperity. It's really not prosperity. We must distinguish between the living wealth of Christ, which gives us liberty, and the existing wealth of the world. The existing material wealth of the world, which is not evil. But we have to make the difference between the two so we can know where we live. We can know where we live and where we experience total and complete victory. Total and complete victory, being fruitful and multiplying. Fruitful and multiplying. Being fruitful and continually multiplying in the likeness of Christ, which is the living of Christ. Because as Christians, we have the privilege of experiencing the life of Christ, which is the life of God. We were never designed to live his life. We can't live his life, but we were designed to experience the fullness and the richness of his life. And him through us bringing that richness and those blessings, those spiritual blessings to those who are under those spiritual curses. And that brings us to the end of this teaching of part 1. I love you and I thank you. And I look forward to fellowshipping with you in the next teaching, which will be part 2 of the same teaching, knowing the difference between Christian liberty and biblical license. See you next time. Love you in the Lord.